came at night. Quiet, methodical, like wolves with paperwork. And when they knocked on your family's door, it wasn't silver or gold they demanded. It was you. A child. A body. A future ripped from its bloodline. What you're about to hear is not myth, not exaggeration, but the forbidden machinery of an empire that fed itself on flesh. The Ottoman Empire is remembered in textbooks as a monument of power, conquest, and architecture. But history, real history, is never the story they want you to see. Behind the domes of mosques and the elegance of palaces was something more horrifying than any battlefield, a sexual order written into law, a system so perverse it weaponized innocence itself. This was not chaos. Not scandal. It was institutional design. The Ottomans mastered the art of control not only through armies and taxes, but through the private destruction of men's sons, the ritualized theft of youth, and the cold mathematics of mutilation. These practices were not whispers on the margins. They were organized, recorded, archived. Somewhere, even now, in the dust of Istanbul's libraries, are ledgers that count not sheep or cattle, but children. Imagine it. An officer arrives with lists in hand. Your name is already written, centuries before you are even born. He knows how many boys your village has produced, how many have been taken, and when the empire is owed another blood payment. To them, you are not a soul. You are inventory. And the truth is darker still. These children were not simply stolen for labor, or war, or tribute. No, they were groomed, conditioned, reconstructed into playthings of empire. Their very identity was erased, rewritten by force. Names forbidden. Languages silenced. Families erased from memory under the lash of Ottoman discipline. Those deemed strong became janissaries, soldiers, forbidden wives, forbidden families, bound only to each other in unnatural bonds the state encouraged. But the most beautiful, the ones cursed by their very faces, were marked for something worse. They would never return. Never grow into fathers. Never know freedom. They were swallowed whole by the private chambers of the palace, where survival meant mutilation, humiliation, and a life stripped of humanity. This is not history taught in schools. This is the hidden scripture of power, where sexuality itself was engineered into a weapon of control. And tonight, you will see exactly how an empire fed its throne with the suffering of boys. The empire called it Devshirme, a word that sounds harmless, even bureaucratic. But in truth, it meant the gathering. Not of crops, not of coin, but of children. It was a levy paid not in silver, but in sons. Picture it. Ottoman officials sweeping through Christian villages of the Balkans, lists in hand, like accountants of despair. They knew the exact number of households, the ages of every boy, the last time that particular village had been harvested. It was precise, methodical, clinical. Mothers screamed. Fathers begged. None of it mattered. When the empire demanded blood, resistance was suicide. The youngest were the most desired. Children as young as 4 ripped from their mother's arms, their tears dismissed as the natural cost of administration. They were not simply taken. They were inspected, teeth checked, muscles felt, intelligence measured. Like livestock, their fates were judged in the cold light of Ottoman calculation. And here is the sinister genius: this system wasn't merely about producing soldiers. It was about breaking the human spirit at its roots. These boys were stripped of everything: their names, their language, their faith. Speaking of family or origin was forbidden. Punished. Beaten out of them. Within months, most forgot their own birth names. Imagine your identity, your history, your bloodline, erased before puberty. You became a blank slate, upon which the empire could write its will. For many, this meant a forced march toward the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite warriors. But these were no ordinary soldiers. They were designed to be celibate, denied wives, denied families, denied a future beyond the state. Their only loyalty was to the Sultan, and their only intimacy, engineered by decree, was with each other. In time, this grew into a military culture where same-sex relationships weren't just tolerated, they were structured, institutionalized. Sexuality itself became another tool of discipline, binding men to their comrades, ensuring their desires could never lead them back to family or rebellion. But the most beautiful boys, the unlucky ones, were torn from this path. Their lives would not be spent on the battlefield. No, they were too precious. They were fed into a darker machine, reserved for the palace and the personal appetites of the powerful. For them, the Devshirme was not a draft. It was a death sentence for everything human within them. This was not war. This was farming, of flesh, of souls, of futures. And it was the foundation upon which the empire built centuries of domination. The palace was not merely a residence. It was a factory of control, a labyrinth where beauty was currency and mutilation the price of service. For the brightest and most attractive boys pulled from the Devshirme, survival often meant something worse than death: castration. The Ottomans wanted eunuchs, men stripped of manhood, denied bloodlines, broken at the root of their identity. But Islamic law forbade Muslims from carrying out such an operation. The solution? Outsourcing. In hidden centers across Egypt and Ethiopia, Christian and Jewish surgeons carried out the work. The process was barbaric. Children were drugged with crude mixtures, their bodies held down, and their genitals removed with knives heated in open fires. Some bled out within minutes. Others died slowly, days of fever and infection consuming them. The survival rate? 1 in 10. The empire calculated this horror as if it were nothing more than logistics. If 100 eunuchs were required, 1,000 boys would be mutilated. 900 corpses would rot in the sand, discarded as waste, while 10 survivors were paraded into service. This is what empire looks like when stripped of its golden facade, an engine that feeds on agony. And yet, for those who lived, life was little more than enslavement dressed in silk. The Ottomans divided eunuchs into two categories. African boys, often subjected to complete removal, became black eunuchs, considered more trustworthy around the Sultan's women. They patrolled the harems, guarding women they themselves could never touch, rising to positions of strange and terrible power within the palace hierarchy. European boys, usually mutilated by partial castration, became white eunuchs. They served in administration, as intermediaries, as attendants in the Sultan's private sphere. Think about the cruelty here. A boy ripped from his family, mutilated into something less than a man, and then dressed in fine robes, placed beside gold and marble, a living reminder that his humanity had been stripped away, and his only purpose was obedience. This was not incidental. It was deliberate. Castration removed not only the body's ability to reproduce but the spirit's connection to future and family. The eunuch became the perfect servant: no legacy, no lineage, no rebellion, no hope. His bloodline ended with him. The empire didn't just conquer lands. It conquered time itself, ensuring that the sons it stole would leave behind no descendants, no traces, no history but the empire's own. If the eunuch was the silent servant of empire, then the köçek was its entertainment, a boy forced into femininity, paraded before drunken crowds as living bait for lust and violence. The word köçek meant little one. And that is exactly what they were: boys, many taken through the Devshirme, too young to resist, too beautiful to be discarded. They were dressed as women, painted with makeup, draped in silks that shimmered under the lamplight of the palace halls. They danced at banquets, their movements trained to mimic the softness of the feminine. But beneath the veils and jewels, everyone knew the truth: they were boys, transformed into objects of grotesque desire. The performances themselves were dangerous. Audiences were not passive. They were frenzied. Diplomats and chroniclers describe scenes of chaos, men so overcome with lust that they fought each other mid-banquet for the right to seize a dancer. Glasses shattered, knives were drawn, throats were cut, all in the madness of competition. And the dancers? They had no protection. They were expected to submit, no matter who approached, no matter how brutal the act. These boys were not simply exploited in the shadows. They were institutionalized performers of corruption, sanctioned by the empire's ruling elite. Their very existence blurred the boundaries between masculine and feminine, between soldier and concubine, between victim and property. They were neither allowed to be men, nor women, nor children. They were something else entirely, a category created by power, existing only to feed the appetites of the strong. The psychological destruction was complete. A boy raised in this world could not cling to identity, family, or dignity. He was dressed to erase himself. He was forced to move his body in ways that provoked his own degradation. Every dance was a ritual of humiliation, every cheer from the crowd a reminder that he had ceased to be human, that his only purpose was to entertain the predators around him. And make no mistake, this was not hidden. It was not shameful. It was celebrated. Parties, festivals, even public gatherings featured the köçek. They were a symbol of the empire's domination, proof that the sultan could take the sons of his enemies and reshape them into anything he wished, soldiers, eunuchs, or dancing boys. This is the truth of empire, not only conquest of land, but conquest of flesh and identity itself. There was one role reserved for the most delicate, the most fragile, the most unnervingly beautiful of the boys taken into the Ottoman machine. They were called Tavşan Oğlanlar, the bunny boys. A name that sounds innocent, until you understand its meaning. Rabbits were symbols of fertility, softness, and prey. And that is exactly what these boys became, prey disguised as spectacle. They were dressed not only in silks but in costumes designed to exaggerate their vulnerability. Long flowing garments, rabbit-like accessories, movements choreographed to emphasize innocence and fragility. They were not dancers like the köçek. They were symbols, embodiments of pure submission paraded for the powerful. And the violence that surrounded them was legendary. Contemporary accounts describe drunken Ottoman elites descending into madness at these performances, tearing at each other, clawing for possession of the boys. Some were beaten to death in the frenzy, others raped in front of the crowd, their cries drowned by music and laughter. The Tavşan Oğlanlar lived not as humans but as offerings, sacrifices to an empire that demanded blood and humiliation as ritual. But here is the deepest truth: this was not only about pleasure. It was about domination. It was about the empire proving, again and again, that no boundary, not childhood, not gender, not innocence, was beyond its reach. By turning boys into bunnies, by reducing warriors' sons into prey animals for aristocrats, the Ottomans broadcasted their message: we control not only your land, but your future, your identity, your bloodline itself. And you, watching this now, you feel the pull, don't you? The unease. The realization that history is not noble, that empire is not civilization, that power is always written in flesh. Men like you were meant to forget this. You were meant to believe history was golden domes and military glory. But what you've heard tonight is the truth behind the curtain. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. I want you to do something dangerous. Something symbolic. If you're still here, comment below: I will not be prey. I will not forget. Type it twice. Once for the boy you were. Once for the man you are becoming. This is how transformation begins, by refusing the lies of history, and by anchoring yourself into forbidden knowledge the world tried to bury. You must understand this: what happened in the Ottoman palaces was not random depravity. It was engineering. A system designed to fracture the human spirit and rebuild it into obedience. Think carefully. Why would an empire castrate boys by the thousands? Why create eunuchs who could never pass on their bloodlines? Why force janissaries into celibacy? Why feminize children into dancers and prey animals? The answer is chilling: because sexuality is the deepest force of identity. If you can control that, you control the man. If you can strip it away, you own him entirely. The Ottomans knew this. They understood that armies can be beaten, villages can resist, but once you've broken a man's lineage, once you've rewritten his intimacy, his desires, his very body, there is no rebellion left in him. He becomes clay. Eunuchs were perfect servants because they had no sons to fight for, no daughters to protect, no legacy to imagine. Janissaries were perfect soldiers because they were forbidden wives, forbidden homes, forbidden futures. They could love only each other, their loyalty trapped inside the walls of the barracks, redirected toward the Sultan himself. And the köçek and bunny boys? They were perfect symbols. They reminded everyone, parents, subjects, enemies, that the empire could take the most innocent, the most beautiful, and make them perform humiliation on command. This was not sexuality. This was weaponized psychology. It was generational warfare, aimed not only at the body but at the soul. The Ottomans transformed Eros, the primal drive to create, to love, to bond, into a mechanism of slavery. And when Eros is chained, so is the future. This is why empires record these acts so carefully. Not because they were ashamed, but because it was policy. Logbooks of children, lists of castrations, inventories of performers. Bureaucracy as horror. Paperwork as violence. Behind the calligraphy and seals lay the quiet genocide of identity. And here is the most unsettling thought, the same principle exists today. Control sexuality, you control society. Flood a culture with vice, confuse its genders, break its families, and what remains? Isolated individuals. Weak. Directionless. Obedient. The Ottomans perfected this centuries ago. And every empire that followed learned from it. The most chilling truth of power is this: the systems of control designed for others eventually devour the rulers themselves. The Ottomans believed they had perfected domination, but in the end, the empire's own bloodline was poisoned by the very practices it enforced. Look into the history of the sultans. You will not find a dynasty of strong men, each rising by merit and virtue. You will find children enthroned before they could even shave. You will find heirs raised in gilded cages, cut off from the world, guarded by eunuchs who themselves were mutilated boys of conquered lands. The ruling bloodline became dependent on the very system it built, a palace of ghosts raising sons who would never know freedom, never know war, never know the world they were meant to rule. And in those gilded halls, corruption festered. Eunuchs became kingmakers, manipulating weak sultans who had been raised among dancers and concubines, not warriors. Mothers of sultans, the Valide sultans, wielded enormous influence, directing politics through harems guarded by mutilated men. Decisions of empire were not made in council chambers but in perfumed rooms thick with intrigue, jealousy, and the whispers of the castrated. And then, the hunger turned inward. Sultans themselves grew addicted to the very spectacles that broke their enemies. They demanded köçek dancers at feasts, they kept tavşin oglanlar for private amusement, they surrounded themselves not with generals but with performers, slaves, and eunuchs. The throne became less a seat of empire, more a theater of appetite. The bloodline withered. Inbreeding, decadence, paranoia, all symptoms of a dynasty that had replaced discipline with indulgence. Sultans ordered their own brothers strangled to prevent rivals. Heirs raised in isolation became paranoid, unstable, sometimes deranged. The machine of domination had turned inward, eating the empire from its own heart. Here lies the ultimate lesson: when power is built on exploitation, it eventually corrupts the master as much as the slave. The Ottomans thought they could control flesh, desire, identity itself. But in time, their rulers became prisoners of the very system they believed gave them strength. The empire crumbled not because it was defeated from outside, but because it rotted from within. And the question now, for you, how much of our world today is walking the same path? You have seen now what lies beneath the golden domes and marble halls. You have seen the truth that was never meant to survive the centuries, an empire that built its strength not only on swords and cannons, but on the mutilation of children, the erasure of families, and the weaponization of desire itself. The Ottoman system was not simply cruel. It was precise. It turned boys into soldiers without families, eunuchs without futures, dancers without dignity, prey without escape. It stripped away identity, generation by generation, until even the memory of resistance was erased. This was not merely history. This was psychology written into law. And here is the shadow that stretches into your world today. The empire may have fallen, but its methods endure. Control intimacy, and you control destiny. Shatter families, and you shatter resistance. Blur identities, confuse gender, flood desire with vice, and men become easy to rule. These lessons were not lost when the Ottomans crumbled. They were absorbed, refined, modernized. Look around, do you see a society of strong men building legacies? Or do you see isolation, addiction, distraction, and men drained of the very energy that once made them dangerous? Understand this: knowledge is power, but dangerous knowledge is transformation. Once you hear it, you cannot return to ignorance. You cannot look at history, or your own life, with the same eyes again. The same system that turned boys into dancers now turns men into consumers. The same empire that erased bloodlines now erases yours, not with chains and knives, but with screens, drugs, and the slow suffocation of identity. And so, the decision lies with you. You can dismiss this as a story of the past, another dark tale to shiver at and then forget. Or you can take it as a warning, a mirror of what happens when men allow themselves to be broken at their roots. You were never meant to hear this. But you have. And now, you are marked by it. Remember the words. Say them again. I will not be prey. I will not forget. Twice. Once for the boy who was taken. Once for the man who survives. Because the empires of today, like those of the past, are always watching, always waiting, for men too weak to resist. The question is, which one are you?